Captain Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of Defense Station Alpha and watched 50,000 alien ships move toward Earth like a dark cloud covering the stars. The enemy fleet stretched across space farther than his eyes could see, and each ship was bigger than anything humans had ever built, and they all carried weapons that could destroy entire cities with single shots. Jake had been fighting aliens for 15 years, but he had never seen anything like this, and he knew that Earth was about to face its final battle. His radio crackled with desperate voices from the surface, and orbital stations reported that enemy scouts were already past Jupiter and moving fast toward the inner system, and every human military base was calling for help that would never come. General Parker had evacuated 3 days ago, along with most of the command staff, and they took the best ships and left behind only volunteers who refused to abandon their home planet. Jake looked at his small team of 200 soldiers and knew they were all that stood between Earth and total destruction, and most of them were young recruits who had never seen real combat before. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered 12 different alien species over 300 years, and they ruled half the galaxy with weapons and technology that made human science look like stone tools. Their ships could move faster than light, and their energy shields could stop nuclear weapons, and their soldiers were 8 feet tall with armor that made them nearly impossible to kill. Jake had fought them on Mars 5 years ago and watched an entire human division get wiped out by just 20 enemy soldiers, and he still had nightmares about that day. But somehow Earth had managed to stay free while every other planet in this part of the galaxy had fallen, and the aliens seemed to save Earth for last, like they were playing with their food. The defense platforms around Earth opened fire first, and their massive cannons sent streams of plasma toward the approaching fleet, but the alien shields absorbed every shot without taking any damage. Jake watched helplessly as the enemy returned fire, and the outer defense ring disappeared in brilliant flashes of light and explosions that lit up the darkness of space. His communications officer, Lisa Brooks, ran up to him with tears in her eyes and told him that Luna Base had gone silent and the moon's defense grid was completely destroyed. The second wave of alien ships moved past the wreckage and headed straight for Earth's orbital stations, and Jake could see their target locks painting red dots on his command center. He grabbed the station intercom and spoke to his soldiers and told them that they were about to face impossible odds, but they were fighting for every human who had ever lived. His demolitions expert, Carl Hayes, reported that the lower levels were ready for evacuation and the emergency shuttles could get most of the crew to the surface before the station was destroyed. But Jake knew that running away would only delay the inevitable, and the aliens would hunt down every human on Earth and in the colonies until their species was extinct. He made a decision that would change everything and told his team that they were staying to fight, and they would make the aliens pay for every meter of space they took. The enemy fleet reached the middle defense ring and tore through the automated gun platforms like they were made of paper, and nothing human weapons could do seemed to slow them down. Jake watched his tactical displays show red enemy contacts everywhere, and the few remaining human ships were falling back toward Earth's atmosphere in full retreat. The alien command ship was bigger than a city, and it moved through space like it owned the universe, and Jake could see smaller ships launching from its bays by the thousands. His sensor operator reported that the enemy was using some kind of psychic coordination system, and all their ships moved together like parts of a single organism. Jake had heard stories about alien mind control, but he had never seen it work on such a massive scale, and it explained how they could coordinate attacks across entire star systems. The first enemy boarding pods hit Defense Station Alpha, and Jake felt the whole structure shake as alien soldiers began cutting through the hull with energy weapons. He ordered his men to defensive positions and checked his rifle one last time and prepared to make his final stand against an enemy that had never been defeated. The station's main power grid flickered as alien weapons overloaded the shields, and Jake knew they had maybe 30 minutes before the whole place came apart. He looked out at Earth hanging in space below them and thought about all the people who were counting on him and his small team to somehow stop an invasion force that had conquered half the galaxy. The aliens had superior numbers and better technology and thousands of years of military experience, but they had never fought humans before, and Jake hoped that would be enough. He led his soldiers toward the sound of cutting tools and energy weapons, and prepared to show the Zephyrian Empire that humans would never surrender their homeworld. The impossible war was about to begin, and Jake Morrison was the only thing standing between Earth and total destruction. The alien soldiers cut through the station hull like it was made of soft metal, and Jake Morrison led his team through the twisting corridors toward the sound of their energy weapons. The Zephyrians were tall gray creatures with 4 arms, and they moved with deadly precision that came from centuries of conquest, and their weapons fired beams of pure energy that could cut through steel. Jake's rifle bullets bounced off their armor like raindrops, and he watched 3 of his soldiers fall in the first few seconds of fighting, and he knew conventional weapons would never be enough. He ordered his team to fall back deeper into the station while Carl Hayes planted explosive charges to slow down the enemy advance and buy them precious time. Lisa Brooks was working frantically at her computer terminal, trying to access the station's emergency systems, and she found something that made her eyes go wide with surprise. She told Jake that there was a sealed research lab on level 7 that had been abandoned when the war started, and the security files said it contained experimental quantum technology. Jake had never heard of any secret research on the station, but he was desperate for anything that might help them fight back against the overwhelming alien force. They fought their way down through the station levels, while alien soldiers pressed their attack from above, and the whole structure groaned and shook under the strain of battle. The research lab was behind 3 layers of security doors, and the computer systems required special codes that Lisa had to hack, while enemy weapons fire echoed through the corridors inside the lab. Jake found equipment that looked like nothing he had ever seen before, and holographic displays showed complex mathematical formulas that hurt his head to look at. Lisa connected her portable computer to the lab systems and discovered that Earth scientists had been working on something called temporal displacement technology for faster than light communication. The quantum field generators were designed to bend space and time on a small scale, but the power requirements were enormous, and the project had been abandoned as too dangerous. Jake could hear alien soldiers getting closer, and he knew they had maybe 10 minutes before the enemy reached the lab and killed them all. Lisa worked desperately to understand the alien technology manuals, while Carl Hayes rigged the lab entrance with every explosive device he could find. The quantum equipment hummed to life when Lisa activated the main power coupling, and the lab filled with a strange blue glow that made the air itself seem to vibrate. She warned Jake that turning on the full system would drain power from Earth's entire planetary defense grid and leave the surface completely unprotected. Jake made the hardest decision of his life and told her to do it anyway, because their conventional weapons were useless, and this was their only chance to fight back. The quantum field generators spun up to full power, and reality seemed to bend around them as space and time began to twist in ways that human minds were never meant to understand. Jake felt like he was falling through an endless tunnel of light and sound, and when the sensation stopped, he found himself back in the command center watching the alien fleet approach. But something was wrong, because his chronometer showed the same time as before, and Lisa was giving him the same report about Luna Base going silent. He tried to warn her about what was coming, but she looked at him like he was crazy and told him that nothing had happened to the lower levels yet. Jake realized that the quantum field had somehow sent him back in time to the beginning of the battle, and he was reliving the same events all over again. He tried to change what happened by giving different orders, but every time he made a major change, the timeline seemed to snap back and reset itself to the beginning. The alien boarding pods hit the station exactly the same way as before, and Jake led his team through the same corridors toward the same research lab. Lisa discovered the quantum technology again and asked the same questions, and Carl Hayes planted the same explosive charges in the same locations. Jake began to understand that he was trapped in some kind of temporal loop that repeated the same 4 hours of battle over and over again, but each time through the loop he learned something new about the alien tactics and weapons, and he started to see patterns in their attack formations. The Zephyrian soldiers always moved in groups of 6, and they always checked the same corners first, and their energy weapons needed 30 seconds to recharge between shots. Jake used this knowledge to fight more effectively in each loop, and he managed to save more of his soldiers and last longer before reaching the research lab after dozens of loops. He could predict exactly what every alien soldier would do and where they would be at any given moment during the battle. He started to realize that the temporal displacement field was not just a weapon, but a tool that could give him an incredible advantage over an enemy that had never faced anything like it. The aliens were used to overwhelming their opponents with superior firepower and technology, but they had never fought an enemy who could learn from every mistake and try again. Jake began to study the alien language and technology during each loop, and he discovered weaknesses in their coordination systems that he could exploit. He learned that the Zephyrian Empire controlled other alien species through fear and manipulation, and their alliance was not as strong as it appeared. The quantum field was teaching him everything he needed to know to win an impossible war, but first he had to figure out how to break free from the time loop. Jake Morrison was no longer just a soldier defending a space station, but a student learning how to defeat an empire that had conquered half the galaxy. Jake Morrison had lived through the same battle 147 times, and each loop taught him something new about the alien empire that was trying to destroy Earth. He learned that the Zephyrian fleet was not just one species, but 12 different alien races working together under the command of gray overlords who ruled through fear. The Kaleri were blue-skinned warriors who hated their Zephyrian masters but followed orders because their home planet was held hostage with weapons that could crack it in half. During loop number 63, Jake managed to intercept communications between Kaleri ships and heard them talking about rebellion in their own language that sounded like singing. The Vorthek were honor-bound soldiers who looked like giant insects, and they served the Zephyrians because they believed it was their sacred duty to follow the strongest leader. Jake discovered that Vorthek culture was based on ancient warrior codes that the Zephyrians had twisted to serve their own purposes, and the insect soldiers did not know they were being manipulated. Nixari provided all the advanced technology that kept the Empire running, and they were small gray creatures who looked almost human except for their large black eyes. In loop number 90, Jake learned that the Nexari homeworld had been destroyed by the Zephyrians 300 years ago, and the survivors worked as slaves to avoid extinction. Each alien species had been conquered and controlled in different ways, but they all shared one thing in common, which was a deep hidden hatred for their Zephyrian overlords. Jake began to realize that the Empire was like a house of cards held together by carefully balanced threats and promises, and if one piece fell, the whole structure would collapse. He started paying attention to the political relationships between different alien fleets and discovered that the species were kept separated to prevent them from working together. The Zephyrians used a psychic coordination network to control their fleet, but Jake noticed that human emotions seemed to create interference in their mental connections. Every time Jake felt angry or determined, the alien coordination faltered slightly and their ships moved with less precision for a few seconds. He experimented with this effect during multiple loops and learned that intense human feelings could disrupt Zephyrian psychic systems in ways they had never encountered before. The Grey Overlords had conquered hundreds of planets, but they had never faced a species that could interfere with their mental control through pure emotional energy. Jake realized that humanity's greatest weakness might actually be their greatest strength, because humans felt emotions more intensely than any other species in the galaxy. During loop number 112, he managed to access the Zephyrian command network by hiding in the wreckage of a destroyed human ship. He listened to their communications and learned that the Empire was much more fragile than it appeared, and many subject species were already showing signs of unrest. The Zephyrian Emperor was an ancient creature that had been alive for thousands of years, and he ruled through a combination of advanced technology and psychological manipulation. Jake discovered that the Emperor kept detailed files on every species in his empire, and he knew exactly which threats to use to keep each race in line. The Kaleri were told that rebellion would result in their children being fed to space monsters, and the Vorthak believed that disobedience would damn their souls for eternity. The Nexari were promised that good service would eventually earn them a new homeworld, but Jake found records showing this promise had been made for 3 centuries without fulfillment. Every species in the Empire had been lied to and manipulated, but they were kept isolated from each Others so they could never compare notes or realize the truth. Jake began to understand that winning this war would require more than just military tactics, and he would need to break the psychological chains that held the Empire. Together, he spent dozens of loops studying alien psychology and learning how to communicate with different species in ways that would bypass Zephyrian mental conditioning. The temporal field had given him access to perfect intelligence about the enemy, but now he needed to figure out how to use that knowledge to turn the aliens against each other. Jake started planning a strategy that would expose the Zephyrian lies to all the subject species at the same time and trigger a galaxy-wide rebellion. He learned the communication frequencies used by each alien fleet and discovered how to override their security systems using human emotional interference patterns. The key was timing, because he would need to coordinate revelations across 12 different species simultaneously while fighting a desperate battle for Earth's survival. Jake Morrison was no longer just learning about his enemies, but preparing to start a revolution that would free every enslaved species in the Zephyrian Empire. The impossible war was about to become something much bigger than just humanity's fight for survival, and Jake held the key to liberating half the galaxy from thousands of years of oppression. Jake Morrison had experienced the time loop 231 times, and now he knew everything there was to know about the Zephyrian Empire and its weaknesses. He had memorized the personal history of every alien commander and learned the secret fears that kept each species loyal to their gray overlords. The Kaleri fleet commander was named Thizes, and his daughter had been taken hostage 20 years ago, and he followed Zephyrian orders because he believed she was still alive. Jake had discovered during Loop 190 that the daughter had died in a prison camp 15 years ago, but Thizes was still receiving fake messages that claimed she was safe. The Vorthek war leader called himself Honored Klaxon, and he served the Empire because he thought it was the will of his ancient gods, who demanded absolute obedience to the strongest ruler. But Jake had found records showing that the Zephyrians had destroyed the original Vorthek religious texts and replaced them with fake scriptures that supported their rule. The Nexari science coordinator had the designation 7-4 Alpha, and she worked for the Empire because she believed her people would eventually be given a new homeworld. Jake knew that the Zephyrians had been making the same promise to the Nexari for 300 years while secretly planning to exterminate them when their usefulness ended. Each species had been trapped by carefully crafted lies that played on their deepest hopes and fears, but they had never been allowed to communicate with each other. Jake began planning the most audacious military strategy in human history, and he would need to break out of the time loop at exactly the right moment to make it work. He had learned that the temporal field could only be escaped during a specific alignment of quantum frequencies that happened once every 4 hours and 12 minutes. Lisa Brooks had figured out the escape sequence during Loop 150, but Jake had chosen to stay in the loop to gather more intelligence about the enemy. Now he had all the knowledge he needed, and it was time to put his impossible plan into action and hope that 200 loops of preparation would be enough. Jake waited for the perfect moment when the alien fleet was in exactly the right position and the Zephyrian command ships were focused on coordinating their final attack. He gave Lisa the signal to initiate the quantum field collapse, and reality twisted around them as the temporal loop finally shattered like breaking glass. When the sensation stopped, Jake found himself back in the research lab, but this time he knew it was real because the chronometer was moving forward instead of resetting. He had only one chance to execute his strategy, and if he failed, then Earth would fall and the galaxy would remain enslaved for another 1,000 years. Jake activated the station's long-range communication array and began broadcasting on every frequency used by the alien fleet, and each message was carefully crafted for a specific species. He told the Kaleri that their children were already dead, and showed them the real prison camp records that proved the Zephyrians had been lying for decades. The Vorthek received copies of their original religious texts that commanded them to fight against false prophets who claimed divine authority through deception. The Nexari learned that their promised homeworld was actually a toxic wasteland that the Zephyrians planned to use as a dumping ground for nuclear waste. Each revelation was timed to reach its target species at exactly the same moment, and Jake watched his tactical displays as confusion spread through the alien fleet. The Kaleri ships suddenly stopped their attack formation, and several commanders began demanding answers from their Zephyrian overseers about the fate of their Hostagas. Verthic warriors started questioning their orders, and some units broke off from the main fleet to form independent battle groups that answered to no one. The Nexari shut down critical technology systems that the Empire depended on, and their science ships began moving away from the Zephyrian command vessels. Jake had triggered exactly the kind of chaos he had planned, but now he needed to keep the rebellion growing before the Empire could regain control. He BROADCAST evidence of every lie the Zephyrians had told and every promise they had broken, and showed each species how they had been manipulated and betrayed. The alien fleet began to tear itself apart as centuries of hidden resentment exploded into open warfare between species that had been forced to work together. Jake led his small human force in lightning strikes against key Zephyrian command ships while their attention was focused on controlling the spreading rebellion. His knowledge from the time loops allowed him to predict exactly where each enemy ship would be and what their weaknesses were at any given moment. The impossible war had become something completely different, and Jake Morrison had turned the galaxy's greatest military force against itself with nothing but truth and perfect timing. Earth was no longer facing conquest, but had become the spark that would ignite a revolution across half the galaxy and free billions of enslaved beings from Zephyrian rule. The alien fleet exploded into chaos as 12 different species turned their weapons on their Zephyrian overlords, and Jake Morrison watched centuries of oppression crumble, and Minotescalari warships opened fire on the Grey command vessels while their crews screamed for justice for their murdered children and families who had died in secret prison camps. The Vorthak battle groups formed ancient honor formations that their religious texts commanded them to use against false prophets, and they charged the Zephyrian ships with suicidal Farine Exery science vessels, shut down the quantum communication networks that held the Empire together, and thousands of ships across the galaxy suddenly lost contact with their commanders. Jake laid his small human force through the chaos and used his perfect knowledge of enemy tactics to strike at exactly the right targets at exactly the right moments. He destroyed the psychic coordination centers that allowed the Zephyrians to control their subject species, and every successful hit made the rebellion spread faster. Lisa Brooks coordinated the human attack from Defense Station Alpha, while Carl Hayes led bombing runs against enemy weak points that Jake had discovered during the time loops. The Zephyrian Emperor appeared on all communication channels, and his ancient face was twisted with rage as he watched his empire tear itself apart. He was a creature that had lived for thousands of years and conquered hundreds of worlds, but he had never faced an enemy that could turn his own forces against him. The Emperor ordered his remaining loyal ships to begin executing the families of rebel commanders, and Jake watched in horror as prison transports began broadcasting death scenes. This brutal retaliation had the opposite effect that the Emperor intended, because it proved to every alien species that Jake's revelations had been completely true. The Kaleri went into a blood frenzy when they saw their loved ones being murdered, and they threw themselves at the Zephyrian ships with desperate courage. Of Orthic warriors abandoned all tactical restraint and began ramming their vessels into enemy command centers while chanting ancient war songs. Even the peaceful Nexari turned violent when they realized that their people had been marked for extermination from the very beginning. Jake realized that the war had grown beyond anything he could control, and the galaxy was experiencing the largest rebellion in recorded history. Millions of ships across hundreds of star systems were fighting against their Zephyrian overlords, and entire planets were rising up to throw off the chains of slavery. The Emperor's desperate brutality only made the rebellion stronger, and Jake could see that the ancient empire was collapsing faster than anyone had thought possible. But the Zephyrian leader had one final card to play, and he ordered his personal dreadnought to target Earth itself with planet-killing weapons. Jake knew from the time loops that the Emperor's ship carried enough firepower to crack Earth's crust and kill every human being in the solar system. The massive dreadnought moved toward Earth while rebel fleets tried to stop it, but its shields were too strong and its weapons destroyed everything that came close. Jake made a desperate decision and ordered every human ship to form up around his position for a final assault on the Emperor's vessel. He broadcast a message to all the rebel species and asked them to follow him in one last attack that would either free the galaxy or die trying. The response was overwhelming as thousands of alien ships from dozens of different species formed the largest combined fleet in Galactic HFY warriors flew alongside Vorthak honor guards, while Nexari science vessels provided technical support for species that had been enemies for centuries. Jake found himself commanding not just human forces but representatives of every enslaved race in the Zephyrian Empire who saw him as their liberator. The final battle began as the combined rebel fleet charged toward the Emperor's dreadnought while Earth hung in space behind them like a blue jewel. Jake's knowledge from the time loops told him exactly where the enemy ship's weak points were, but reaching them would require sacrifices that would cost thousands of lives. He led the attack personally, and his small human force punched through the dreadnought's defenses while alien allies covered their approach with devastating firepower. The Emperor appeared on Jake's communication screen, and his ancient eyes burned with hatred as he realized that a single human soldier had destroyed his thousand-year empire. Jake Morrison had started the day as a forgotten defender of a doomed space station, but now he was leading the greatest liberation army in galactic history against tyranny itself. Jake Morrison led the final assault on the Zephyrian Emperor's dreadnought while thousands of rebel ships from across the galaxy followed him into the most desperate battle in recorded history. The massive enemy vessel was larger than most cities, and its weapons could destroy entire fleets, but Jake knew from the time loops exactly where its critical systems were located. He flew his small fighter through a storm of energy beams while Kaleri warriors and Vorthak honor guards died around him to clear a path to the dreadnought's core. The Emperor's ship was protected by shields that had never been penetrated, but Jake had learned during Loop 193 that human emotional energy could disrupt the field generators. He broadcast on all frequencies and told every human in the solar system to focus their hope and determination on this single moment when freedom would be won or lost forever. The response was immediate as millions of people on Earth and the colonies joined their minds and hearts together in a wave of pure human emotion that washed across space. The Emperor's shields flickered and failed as human feelings overwhelmed the psychic systems that had protected Zephyrian ships for thousands of years. Jake led the rebel fleet through the gap and into the heart of the dreadnought, where the Emperor waited in his command chamber surrounded by his most loyal guards. The ancient creature was tall and gray, with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, but now they burned with the fury of absolute defeat. He challenged Jake to single combat according to ancient galactic law, and declared that the winner would decide the fate of every species in the Empire. Jake accepted, even though he knew the Emperor had fought and killed thousands of warriors over the millennia and possessed strength and speed beyond human capability. The battle was brief and brutal as the ancient tyrant used weapons and techniques that predated human civilization, but Jake had something the Emperor had never faced. He fought with the desperate courage of someone who had lived through the same battle hundreds of times and who carried the hopes of every enslaved being in the galaxy. Jake's final blow sent the Emperor crashing to the deck of his own ship, and the ancient creature whispered with his dying breath that humans would bring chaos to the ordered galaxy. The Emperor's death sent a signal across the quantum communication network, and every Zephyrian ship in the galaxy received the message that their immortal leader was gone. The remaining gray overlords surrendered immediately because their entire culture was based on absolute obedience to the Emperor, and without him they had no purpose. Jake found himself standing in the command center of the most powerful ship in the galaxy while representatives of 12 different alien species knelt before him. They offered him the position of Galactic Emperor and promised to serve humanity as they had once served the Zephyrians, but Jake rejected their offer immediately, told them that the age of empires was over and that every species should be free to govern itself without bowing to any master. The Rebel fleet broke apart as each alien race returned to their homeworlds to rebuild their civilizations and establish new governments based on freedom instead of fear. Jake Morrison returned to Earth as the most famous human in galactic history, but he refused all offers of political power and military command. He chose instead to work as a simple construction worker, helping to rebuild the cities that had been damaged during the final battle. Years later, an alien cadet from the new Galactic Council found Jake working on a construction site in the ruins of New York City. She did not recognize the man who had saved the galaxy, and she asked him what he knew about the legendary human hero who had won the impossible war. Jake smiled and told her that sometimes the most important victories come from ordinary people who refuse to give up even when facing impossible odds. He said that heroes are not born but made by the choices they make when everything seems hopeless, and that anyone can change the course of history if they are willing to try. The young alien left without knowing that she had been talking to Jake Morrison himself, and he returned to his work helping to build a better future for all species. Earth had become a symbol of hope and resistance throughout the galaxy, and human military academies taught alien officers the unpredictable tactics that had won the war. The galaxy was finally free from tyranny, and every species could choose its own destiny. But Jake Morrison remained content to be forgotten by history. He had saved billions of lives and liberated half the galaxy, but he was happiest working with his hands and knowing that freedom would endure across the stars.